Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Sporty's webinar on Ask an Air Traffic Controller. My name is Brett Kobe. I'll be your facilitator this evening, and I'm thrilled that we have Eddie Albert with us this evening as well, an air traffic controller and much, much more that I'll talk about shortly from Greater Cincinnati International Airport. We're in the Cincinnati area. This webinar today is presented by Sporty's Pilot Shop. We're also in the Cincinnati area at the Claremont County Airport. Eddie's fantastic in working with local pilots in the Cincinnati area, and then also working with groups like this and webinars to share his expertise and answer questions that pilots have about air traffic control as it relates to our flying. Quick overview. We've had about 700 questions written in, which very, very excited to see the interest in this topic. It's something that pilots of all experience levels work with in air traffic control from the time they're a student pilot all the way up through. We had advanced questions from airline pilots flying in the flight levels. So we've got a wide variety of topics we're going to cover with Eddie this evening. A little bit about Eddie. Again, I've worked with Eddie about 18 years now with various training programs. Currently, he's a quality control specialist at the Cincinnati International Airport, which is a Class B airport, very busy. And he's intimately familiar with the radar operations from the approach control standpoint, the Cincinnati Tower, and the ground operations, of course, that go with that. He's been an air traffic controller for over 38 years. And again, what's unique about Eddie, he's also a commercial pilot and a flight instructor. He's an active pilot here in the Cincinnati area, flies Cessna aircraft. So again, kind of brings that approach that we're looking for as pilots and understanding air traffic control. A little more about his experience. Also worked control towers in Gainesville, Florida, Knoxville, the busy Daytona Beach Airport with the Embry-Riddle traffic. And then again, today he's at Greater Cincinnati, which is actually in Kentucky, but the Greater Cincinnati Airport that serves the Cincinnati area. Eddie, welcome. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, again, we're very excited and happy to have you here. I'm going to turn it over to you for a little bit just to talk about how things have changed in your experience in the last year and how things are getting back to normal again.
Well, I got to spend most of the year in the basement monitoring their operation from my basement. But controller-wise, the staffing was cut at least in half at most facilities. Crews did not intermingle with each other. They were kept separate. So at changeover time, there wasn't much overlap. Different crews would work from different sectors in the radar room. We're lucky because we were at one time really busy, so we have a lot of scopes. So we did our best to keep people from cross-contamination, as you would say. But we are back 100% staffed now. At Cincinnati, we have a lot of training to do. We have 14 people that have been waiting for the last year to get involved in training because our training totally stopped unless you were in radar training. That was the only position you were allowed to continue in. So we're a little behind in training, so we're working to get back up to speed on that. There were times we had what was called ATC 0, and that would be when someone in the facility got tested positive for COVID. They would shut down the facility and come in and clean the whole place. So during an ATC 0 event, aircraft were worked around our airspace. And if it happened at another facility, we would just go around their airspace, which was really inconvenient if you were landing at the main airport. Someone does take the airspace. In our case, it's the center, but they're not used to working our traffic, so it would move a lot slower. But if you were an overflight, you had to go around the airspace of the facility that goes ATC 0. ATC 0 has been around for years. It's what we do if a facility cannot function. With the new advances, ADS-B, and being able to pipe in other radar sites, it's a lot less likely that this ever happens again. Today, the Cincinnati radar was down, and you wouldn't have known it. I mean, the radar was not turning at all, but because of ADS-B, we could still see all the aircraft. Not really been any procedural changes. Our traffic is back to about 90% of what it was pre-COVID. And hopefully you GA guys had a good time having a free run of the airspace, which is now starting to get crowded again.
Yeah, I fly general aviation, Cessna and Piper aircraft, and I know the few flights I did last year, there was a lot of cleared as filed and a lot of dead space on the radio, especially summer into in the fall time. I had a lot of interest, Eddie, starting off and how people in general interested in aviation become an air traffic controller. So what is that process, and how does one get into the air traffic control profession?
Well, I'd say the best way is to join the military, but that takes up 5 years of your life. They'll teach you for free, and you can not only work for us, but you can work for contract towers, like our satellite Lunken is a contract tower operation. But most of us don't want to join the military, so you can go to a school, and some of the schools will give you a CTO, which is a control tower operator's license. But pretty much everyone just has to pass a test. Once a year in about the springtime, we open it up for applicants to take the test, and that only stays open usually for about a week. They then set up various testing places around the United States. You go and you get tested. If you score high enough, then you're lined up for a physical, and they start you into the hiring process. It only happens once a year, and then they'll hire those people over the course of the next year. It's like we hire about 1,000 people a year, and obviously we can't train that many, so it's spread out over the course of the year. You have to go to Oklahoma City for 3 to 4 months, depending on whether or not you're a center controller or a terminal controller. And the pay in Oklahoma City is not the greatest, but it's good for starting. Most of the controllers are not pilots, and
Is it normal? I know you got your start at some control towers. Is it normal to start in a smaller control tower and then work your way into a radar facility, or how does that usually work?
yeah, in the old days, that's how we did it. Nowadays, they pretty much will stick you right into a radar facility, because we've contracted out so many of the towers. It's unlikely you'll go someplace really busy like Chicago. Any of the top, I'd say 20 towers, you probably won't go to those facilities. But you could go to a place like Louisville, Indianapolis, Lexington, Cincinnati. We teeter just on that line of we're starting to get busy enough that we don't normally get people from the academy, but every now and then they will send an academy graduate to us.
Okay. I've heard too that, and this might not be true, and you can break the myth if so, that heading south is often a popular option as a controller.
Yes, the controllers do like to go south where it's warm. We used to have 9 regions, and the southern region was always the one that had no problem getting people. So if you wanted to get hired by the FAA and your score wasn't the best, you went to Anchorage.
Nice.
Go someplace where no one else wants to go, and then work your way back.
It's interesting. So you mentioned not all air traffic controllers are pilots. What do you see in the trend there? Are you seeing controllers get their pilot's license maybe after they become a controller, some that already have their certificate, or in your career, what are you seeing that kind of trending towards? Because I could personally tell when working with a controller or talking to them on the radio if they are a pilot and have flown versus not. But how's that trending in the last 10 to 20 years?
I'd say there's fewer pilots, more and more younger people are being hired. Myself, I got hired when I was 20, but that was not the trend. The trend was usually people 25 to 30 was the age group, I think, that was more likely to get hired. And it's being put forth more as a career, so people are coming into it right after college. So they haven't had a chance to, have enough money to go out and earn a pilot's license.
Okay. Now you hear the stories and some of the tales of pilots in the radar room or in the control facility that can help the pilots if they're unfamiliar with the situation. Is it safe to say that in the radar room or in a center facility, there's probably at least one pilot around that could help in a situation like that?
Yes, I would say there would be, but depending on the type plane you're flying, I don't know how much help we can be. If you're flying a Baron, and I've never flown a Baron, I don't know that I could, help you a lot. But if you're just flying a Cessna, you're in pretty good shape. There'll be people that can help you.
Good, good. And I think that's a lot of times, student pilots and private pilots just after the certificate want to feel comfortable knowing, not that they have to depend on that, but that there could be some resources there. Uh, so kind of moving into the responsibilities of air traffic controllers, and we see the movies and we see, some various depictions, but how many airplanes at any one time is a typical controller working with?
Well, that's a really good question. It all depends on what kind of a line you're working. If they're all going different directions, you could have 5 or 7 aircraft and you could be really busy. But if you have the whole airspace there, approach controllers usually work between a 30 to a 40-mile radius around the airport. That's a lot of space, and you throw those airplanes all off in different directions, and I can work 15 and I'm not even breaking a sweat. But I've worked final before, which is you're compacted into the amount of airspace you have. It's very small, and you've got 7 airplanes and you're real busy. But it's the constant turnover. You're always getting a plane and you're getting rid of a plane. And every time someone checks in, you got to validate the mode C, confirm the assigned altitude, and you give them a new heading. So there's a lot being done all the time. So it's a
Gotcha.
hard question.
Sure. Well, how's that compare then to your time at Daytona with the Embry-Riddle and a lot of VFR airplanes?
Embry-Riddle it's just crazy in Daytona Beach. Don't fly below 4,000 feet because there's just so many planes. Conflict alert goes off constantly. We had it down to a beep and a half was all you got for a conflict alert, because you depart aircraft 3,000 feet apart. Well, on radar, 3,000 feet is pretty close together, and they'll be conflicting alert for the next half hour till they get out of your airspace.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I've flown in that area, and with ADSB now and traffic on our iPad and on the panel, you've got to zoom in tight, to see any differences. So I can't imagine, and that's probably a special skill just alone for controllers to work and get comfortable with. And a lot of student pilots in the area also. A common question we get and concerns from pilots is, what's one thing that you wish you could tell pilots that would make your life easier or life easier for a controller?
Well, you don't have to read back everything, but the read back is your tool, because what you read back becomes your clearance. I don't. People ask me what should they read back, and I'd say nothing, because I don't want to listen to you, uh, because then what I said rules. But when you read something back, if you read back it wrong, say I say maintain 7, and you come back and say maintain 6, well, your new clearance is now 6,000 feet.
If you don't correct it,
So
you mean?
yeah, if I don't come back and correct it, yeah, they're good to go to 6,000. So it's don't tie up the radio too long. Um, we want to be short and concise, but it all depends how busy the controller is. If you don't hear anything going on, then you have plenty of time to talk to me. But if you hear me talking to one airplane after another airplane, this is a time to be quiet.
Sure, and I think that brings up another common question, especially for pilots new to communicating on the radio and feeling comfortable. If they're having trouble understanding or comprehending because the controller is reading too fast, and a lot of times that'll happen, I know, in busy New England airspace, because it's just a matter of time to get all the information out there. But if a pilot does feel that they're being rushed or they're not understanding, what kind of advice do you to give to them at that point?
Well, just tell the controller to say again. Ask them to slow down. Tell them you're a student pilot, and you say, "Well, I'm a private pilot," and I say you're a student pilot. You're working on your ATP. You are a student pilot. Uh, that'll get our attention the most. Not that many people actually will use that and say that they're a student. So just tag that on there.
Yeah, so you don't feel like it's a negative thing, or that that you're not displaying weakness by doing that, but you'd prefer it in that case so that you can be aware of that and handle them better. And I think a lot of times, at the busier airports, in my experience too, that controllers are used to just handling the professionals in and out, and may not think that that aircraft or that pilot may be a student or new. So I assume you would appreciate that then, to know that, and it's not really impinging on what you're doing at that point.
Yeah, and sometimes we need to be educated. I used to tell the controllers, you could go back to the day when Comair used to fly, you could say anything to them while they were rolling down the runway after landing, and they would turn off the runway and go directly into the Comair ramp, because they knew that's where they parked. And we were talking to them way too early. But you couldn't get that across to the controller, because they seemed to do what we told them to do, which was basically turn into their ramp.
Right, right.
It takes someone to speak up, because next time it's United. Well, United doesn't fly into Cincinnati 3 times a day, so he's not necessarily going to react the same. He's going to have a harder time understanding what it is we said. And telling him to say again, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I think, and you hear the stories where the controller snaps back at the pilot, or for some reason, he's having a bad day or something, and when we all think all controllers act that way, but that's really not the case. You know, the point is to communicate and get the message across, and as you mentioned, as efficiently as possible. Don't need to read everything back. But yeah, don't be afraid to say student pilot or to say slow down, or like you said, say again.
I mean,
Let's switch. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead. We
Let's
had a guy from
switch gears
Alabama.
here.
We had a guy from Alabama. He said, "I'm from Alabama. Y'all gonna have to slow down." It's
I
great.
hear
I love it.
get the liven it up a little bit because it doesn't always have to be 100% serious all the time. Let's switch gears, talk about tower and ground operations. And let's first focus on a Class D airport. Um, First, let's talk about arriving. I know you want to talk a little bit about the flows and how that works and what pilots can expect from some of the clearances they'll get from the tower controller.
Well, I mean, we teach controllers to start thinking about the flow on your way to work. You know, before I leave the house to go fly, you know, I tune in the ASOS and find out what the winds are, and I start thinking about, you know, what operation I'm going to have when I get to the airport. You know, and you can do the same. You know, you should be familiar with, you know, the airport that you fly out of all the time. You know, I know they put touch and goes over there on the, you know, the west parallel, and the wind's out of the south today, so you know we'll be able to depart to south and either turn out to the east or the west, and just get an idea in your mind how the traffic is flowing.
Common question here we got also, it relates to distances. And, you know, so the controller is going to issue a pattern entry, whether it's downwind, base, or final. And a common entry procedure that for those that fly at non-towered airports, we're used to flying the downwind leg first, base and final. But a common entry procedure is to go right into the base leg. So when the controller says report a 2-mile base, what's that in reference to in terms of distance that you're expected to report that?
Okay, so the 2-mile base would be 2 miles from the final position. Is considered to be the 2-mile base, not necessarily out from the runway, but from the extended center line of the runway. These are the 3 basic reporting points. I worked at a facility, we didn't have radar, so we had to go all on reporting points. And so the 3 favorite were a midfield downwind, 2-mile base, and a 3-mile final. And the reason we use these is because you have options. When you report on a 3-mile final, if I want you to follow the aircraft on base, I can widen you out, you know, to the left or the right for you to follow that aircraft on the base. When you report on a 2-mile base, I could turn you to the downwind, or I could tell you to turn slightly to your left and follow the aircraft that is already on the downwind. So I got options. And of course, the person who enters on the midfield downwind, we always say he's last because a downwind can go forever.
Now, after landing, does pilots had concerns? A couple questions on this. After landing, first off, do they need to expedite to get off the runway as quickly as possible? First question. Second question then is, what's the optimal point to turn off, or do you expect the controller to issue a turn off instruction? Because sometimes they're busy and they may not have time to do that. So what's your advice there for pilots after landing as you're rolling out?
Yeah, I default to the AIM, which tells you to exit the runway as soon as practical. As a controller, if I didn't want you to exit as soon as practical, then I should say something to you. You should kind of plan your arrival. Like at Lunken, they have a pretty long runway, and there's no turnoffs. I mean, I think you're a good 5,000 feet down the runway before you have an available turnoff. So you know you can make a normal landing, but you know don't slow down to a crawl. Keep your aircraft moving if it's going to be a while before you get to that turnoff. So that's something to look at while you're on final there to see how far it is to a turnoff. There certainly should not be any hurry on your part. You know, unless the controller has said something after landing, expedite clearing the runway. You know, just don't rush, but you know don't dilly-dally either. And you need to keep taxiing until you cross the hold short lines. Now that may mean you have to taxi onto another taxiway. At Cincinnati, pretty much in order to clear a runway, a 737 is going to have to proceed onto the parallel taxiway. It's the ground controller's job to be aware of aircraft exiting the runway and then make sure that he's, you know, has room for that 737 to clear the runway.
What if
So
I'm
keep taxiing until your tail's clear.
what if I'm rolling out and I see on the right I see a taxiway and then another runway? What's the best option there?
Okay, don't exit onto a runway. Only exit onto a taxiway, and never stop on a runway because there actually could be somebody landing behind you. If there's another Cessna following you, you do not need to be clear of the runway. You just need to be 3,000 feet from the threshold for me to be legal to land an aircraft behind you.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, if it's a twin, then they got to have 4,500 feet.
Huh. That's a new one to me. Okay, I guess it doesn't happen very often, but it gives some flexibility in tight spaces.
Yeah, it depends, on the airport. In Daytona Beach, we did it all the time, especially for the Embry-Riddle aircraft. They would want to turn off at the very end of the runway, and sometimes they would make a long landing, and they wouldn't even be on the ground yet, and the aircraft behind them would have landed. So I've seen as many as 5 on a runway at one time.
Wow. Let's talk about departing Class D or really B or C airport. So I know you have some presentation information here to kind of go through that process and answer a lot of the questions along the way.
Okay, so this would be departing from any airport that had radar service at that airport, so Class C or B probably. When you're calling clearance delivery, you're going to give them your call sign, the type aircraft, give them the ATIS information, and then tell them what you want. Do you just want VFR Flight Following to Lexington at 4,500, or maybe you just want to depart to the south? But this is a great time to get set up for flight following. So I would ask this person, for flight following, if you want to participate in flight following, that's totally up to you. Pretty much though, in our Class B airspace, we like to know where your destination is because it's easier to put you in the system to your destination. And when you get with radar, you can always cancel with them. It's easier for us to get our information transferred from the tower to the TRACON. So you call and you give him your request, and then the next slide is going to show the clearance that we would give back to you. November 260 Mike Golf, Cincinnati clearance delivery, cleared out of Bravo airspace, fly runway heading, maintain 4,000, departure frequency 126.65, squawk 4410, expect runway 18 left. If it was a Class Charlie, I wouldn't be saying cleared out of the Bravo. I don't see anything for a Charlie. The fly runway heading, we almost always issue that just so that the local controller has control over the situation. We don't want you getting airborne and all of a sudden you're starting a turn. So we'll issue that a lot to everybody. The maintain 4, in this case you requested 4,500. The highest altitude our clearance delivery is allowed to issue is 4. So I gave you a hard altitude or an IFR altitude, even though you were VFR. And so here's an opportunity for you to sound cool on your readback. All those numbers, they can't be interchanged. So you can just say, Roger, fly runway heading 4, 126.65, 4410, 18 left. And that's a nice quick readback, and I got all the information I need. Now, back to a Class D. Class Ds a lot of times do not have clearance delivery, or if they do, it's being worked by the ground controller. And so you're not necessarily asking for radar service, but this is an opportunity to tell them which direction you're going to go. So when you call ground control in a Class D would be when you would state your direction of flight. Beacon codes. So if I give you, well, each approach control is given a subset of squawks. So Indianapolis Approach Control has 0300 through 0377. Cincinnati has 0400 through 0477. If you get one of those codes, they're only good in that approach control's airspace. So if you get something other than a 0 followed by a 1, 2, 3, or 4, you know that has gone into the center's host computer, and you will now be given flight following all the way to your destination as long as we can keep you in radar contact. So now you're ready to call ground control for your taxi. Now at some airports, there's a lot of aircraft on the ramp, and it's hard to tell who is calling us. So we appreciate if you can move out from the midst of all the other aircraft so that we can see that it's you getting ready to give us a call. The next slide, I got a picture of Lunken. Lunken has a lot of T-hangers, and I don't know if you can see the yellow X there in the middle of the screen, but from the tower, you're looking out and you see a Cessna sitting there, and the red X is actually the Cessna who calls you ready for taxi. So I'm looking at the yellow X and I issue taxi instructions, and meanwhile that red X is the one who I'm actually talking to, and after he gets done with the clearance, he writes his stuff down, he fiddles around a little bit, and he finally starts to taxi, and then an aircraft comes and exits the runway onto taxiway Bravo, and not knowing I have someone coming out of that T hangars, I taxi him to the ramp, and he conflicts then with the Cessna coming out of the other T hangars. So it's just helpful if you taxi out from those T hangars to a spot where we can see you when you call ground control.
I think an important point I learned over the years is to study in advance, especially at unfamiliar airports where the non-movement area ends and begins the actual active taxiways. And usually, in my experience, that's usually within sight of the control tower at that point. Look for that solid line with the dashes getting out into just the edge of that non-movement area. So talk to us a little bit about the call to ground control at a Class D airport in a case like this.
Yeah, the three things to remember: it's who you are, where you are, and what you want to do. And that typically gets you through any situation you're in. So you're van 260 Mike Golf, you're at Delta Air Elite, ready to taxi for departure, and you want to go eastbound. It's just that simple.
Now, if I'm at a satellite airport within a Class B or C airport or underneath it, let's say, can I request flight following from the Class D ground controller at that point?
Yes, you can, and that's really up to them as to whether or not they decide to give it to you or not. If you ask for Bravo service, they are supposed to put you into the system, because at that point, you're saying I want to exit and go into the Bravo. So to make it easier on us, they're required by the letter of agreement to put you into the system.
Now, with the controller at the smaller satellite tower, do they actually communicate with the controller, the radar room at the Class B facility, or how does that work?
Yes, for IFR departures, they actually will electronically send us a request for release. It used to be they would call verbally on every release. So the IFRs, they'll do it electronically, and if we accept it, it'll flash back at them, and they have 3 minutes to get that aircraft airborne. On VFRs, they're allowed to just let you depart and then just call us. And because at that point you're not cleared into the Bravo airspace, you still have to remain outside of the Bravo airspace until you actually receive a clearance into Bravo airspace.
Okay, so you'll never get that from the satellite tower. That would only come once you're airborne and talking to the approach controller.
Correct.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the specific taxi instructions and some of the nuances there.
Okay, so we will give you the entire route unless there's a hold short in it. If there's a hold short in it, we should only give you that route up until the time we're telling you to hold short of a runway. So I'd say runway 18 left, taxi via Mike, and Mike 2, hold short of runway 27. It's mandatory to read back runway hold short instructions. So you should read back, Roger, hold short of runway 27. If you don't, I'll say, I need you to read back the runway hold short instructions. At that point, once you get to 27, when I tell you to cross the runway, I will state where you're crossing it at. So I will say cross runway 27 at Mike 2. Seems kind of redundant, seeing as you're at Mike 2, where else are you going to cross? But it's a requirement just because there's been cases where aircraft have been at the wrong place and have crossed runways they shouldn't have crossed. We're both at fault, but one of the fixes was to say where you're going to cross the runway at. And I'm only allowed to clear you to cross one runway at a time. So even though the next runway is, only 1,000 feet away, I'll say cross runway 27, hold short of runway 36 center. And then after you've cleared 27, I'll say cross runway 36 center at Juliet. So only one crossing at a time. There are rare exceptions where the runways are just too close for aircraft to hold in between, and then there's exceptions that you can, do two at a time. When in doubt, ask for a progressive taxi. Right now, Cincinnati has got major construction going on, and it's just confusing. Or if you go to Lunken, it gets confusing. So you ask for a progressive, and I'm only going to give you a little bit at a time. I'll just tell you to exit the T hangars with a left turn on taxiway Charlie. And then once I see you on Charlie, I'll give you the next instruction. And that way I'm following you the whole way. And you don't have to be a student pilot to ask for this. You can be, just an unfamiliar pilot at an airport. You just feel uncomfortable. You taxi at night and you're down there in the midst of those lights and it's hard to see where you are, especially at an intersection. So asking for a progressive is not a bad idea. what I love here at Lincoln is all the crossings you have to do. For that aircraft to get out to runway 21 left, he's got to cross the approach path to 3 left, then he's got to cross 7, and then he's got to cross 21 right, and then he's got to cross 25 to get to the runway.
So you mentioned at night, and from the controller standpoint, and I know Greater Cincinnati has some of this equipment. What do you have in the tower controller to monitor position of aircraft without visually looking at them? Any electronic or screens or anything that can show aircraft position on the surface?
Yeah, our surface display looks just like our radar displays now. I get your call sign, I get your type aircraft, I get your route of flight, but I can follow you every step of the way without ever looking out the window. I can see you. So when the weather is 600 feet visibility, we're still moving as many airplanes as fast as when there's unlimited visibility. So we can have an eye on you the whole time. It also has warnings to it. So if you were landing and someone stumbled onto the runway, it would give us an alert. Someone lines up now with the taxiway, we're going to get alerts on that now.
Lining up on the ground or in the air on a final approach?
On final approach, I'm sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
if you line up for a taxiway, it'll give us an alert, which is going to be interesting with helicopters. So,
what kind of
somebody asked about
facilities
helicopters.
Yeah. What that was, if they're unfamiliar with the airport, yeah, that was a helicopter question. Inbound to, let's say, Lunken here, we're looking at this airport diagram, and they're approaching from the east. What is the best call out, and if they're unfamiliar, the best way to request a landing at a certain FBO?
Yeah, if you don't know where to go, I can't really help you. I'll tell you, there's Texaco over there, there's Chevron over here. You have to, the decision's up to you at that point. But typically we will land the helicopters on a taxiway. Landing on a ramp is between the airport owner and the whoever owns the land. So at a long time at Cincinnati, you were not allowed to land a helicopter on the ramp. You had to say clear to land taxiway Alpha, air taxi to the ramp, which is basically the same with a helicopter, but just the legal in case someone got hurt. There's a whole short lines. You always can cross the broken side. Don't cross the solid side unless you've been told to. So when you're clearing the runway, look for that hold short line and know you have to cross it. Don't decide, oh, this is the wrong place to turn off and veer back towards the runway. This is I think it was a King Air, and a 727, I believe, is what hit him. So exit the runway, get off the runway.
Good advice.
I got digged on that on my last on my biannual flight review. I was taxiing too fast down the runway, and I said,
oh, yeah.
I want to get off the runway.
You're looking at it from a different perspective than what the controller's thinking.
Definitely.
But one last question on the towered airport departure, and this really goes for any airport where there's a control tower, but as the traffic line builds up, let's say you're approaching the runway that you're cleared to for takeoff, and you're 4/5 in line, there's a couple other aircraft in front of you. Should you tell the tower when you are 4th or 5th in line, or should you wait until you're number 1, or what's the best procedure in that case?
Yeah, now if there's a true line where aircraft can't get around each other, then you don't need to call us because nobody can get around you. But if you have pulled off into the run-up area and now you're wanting to get in the line, then you need to call me so that I can get you into the sequence at the runway. But yeah, if everyone's lined up nose to tail, you don't need to say anything because I'll know, when you get there, I'm going to expect it to be you. And the ground controller is responsible to have worked out the sequence and make sure everyone knows who's who. But if you're in a run-up pad, you need to give me a call. We consider jets ready for departure when they get down there, so they don't normally call us if we're paying attention. We'll just clear them for takeoff. But as a prop, we typically do a run-up, so we pull off to the side. So we need to know when you're ready.
Okay. Let's talk about Class B and C a little bit more, and this is not necessarily at the airport itself, but the surrounding environment. Now, we talked about VFR flight following a little bit. Do you prefer aircraft request flight following? Do you want to be talking to the transient aircraft if they're not necessarily in the airspace, but they're within 30 or 40 miles of the primary airport or flying underneath the shelf of a Class B? What's your preference? Is it more workload, or do you want to know who they are and what they're doing?
Well, it's always good to know who you are, but the more aircraft I work, the more money I get paid. So I want to talk to you. I also puts me in the position where I get to control you. which is always good. But if I'm talking to you and I say, well, you're at 4,500 feet, I usually say, Roger, report prior to altitude change. So I'm going to assume you're staying at 4,500 feet, and I'm going to separate you from other aircraft based on the fact that you're going to stay at 4,500 feet. If you're not talking to me, I never know when you're going to change altitudes. You may all of a sudden decide there's some clouds here, I want to climb, or it's turbulent. So we always prefer to talk. The downside for you is you might want to get closer to Cincinnati than I want you to. So by not talking to us and staying underneath the Bravo, you can probably get closer to Cincinnati. Of course, the downside to that is we have a lot of heavy jets that you might encounter some wake turbulence on. So please, talk to us. We, don't be afraid to talk to us. We're just normal people, just like you are, and give us the opportunity to serve you.
Okay. What about if I'm flying en route and, in this case, we're looking at a screenshot of Greater Cincinnati, the Class B tops out at 10,000. What if I want to fly over to 11,500? Does that cause an issue in terms of what's going on, aircraft transitioning above or below? Is that similar to flying below it without talking to you, or any differences there at the higher altitudes?
The difference is above 10, the jets are moving a lot faster. If you turn the TAC chart over on the other side, you can see our arrival and departure areas. And if you look really closely on an iPad, it's there in the faint blue lines, but it'll show you the four corners that we come into our airspace between 9 and 11,000 feet. So you'd kind of want to avoid those areas. It was funny that the Class B stops at 10 because the jets are coming in usually at 11, so they're above it, and then they descend down into it. So definitely would be a good time to talk to us if you're going to go across at 10.5, so at least we saw you. We sometimes tag aircraft that are not calling, just walking the VFR, and they're at 10.5, and we tag them, hit me, just to bring people aware of the fact that you're there. Because the big thing is you're going to set off the TCAS on these larger aircraft. TCAS does not recognize 500 feet. And even in situations where we are working you, and we know you're at 10.5, and we tell the jet you're at 10.5, and they're at 11, if their TCAS goes off and they can't see you, they're going to react to the TCAS.
Okay. And you'd rather get them around you by talking and separate traffic, like the main mission is, by knowing who you are and what you're doing.
Right, I would. And listen, if the controller, vectors you way out of the way, you are above the Class B, you can say, I want to terminate radar service, and then just go on your own. I had a King Air do that once, and he was going out the arrival fix, and we wouldn't let him do it. We turned him. He said, I'll cancel radar, and that's what he did. He canceled, and then he was head on with a bunch of aircraft, but it's your choice.
There's probably a reason, right?
Yeah.
Now, if I am inbound and I want to land, a couple questions here we'll tie together. If I'm coming to Cincinnati and I want to land at the main Class B airport, is that a problem for controllers to fly a Cessna into a busy airline airport? And if you do say it's okay, how far out should I be contacting the approach controller to plan for that and allow time to get the clearance into the Bravo airspace?
Always earlier the better. Approach controls are at least looking out 30 miles. So if I was going to ever talk to any approach control, I'm calling them 30 miles out, establish the service so that you don't get caught, getting close to the Bravo airspace and then not being able to get a clearance. We are unique in that we are not a very busy Class B. Our numbers are way down. So coming here is really not a problem. In fact, a couple months ago, we noticed a university aircraft kept flying through our airspace. They were transitioning, and they were causing us a really hard time because of the way that they were transitioning through our airspace, and there were so many of them. And we actually called and says, oh, you need Bravo service? Well, why don't you just come in and land at Cincinnati? Because we have 3 runways, it's not a big deal to accommodate you, because there's 3 runways. The 747 can pass you without giving you wake turbulence on one of the other runways. So as long as you're not IFR, it's not a problem. Now, if you're IFR, I can't let that 747 pass you because of separation requirements. We don't have the staffing that we would need to do that. So IFR wise, I want you to do 170 knots. I can live with 150, but a Cessna out there at 110 is really going to hurt me. So you have to come at a good time.
Can you turn that aircraft away, or what's the rules with that?
Well, it's first come, first serve. So depending on how long ago you called me, Delta, when he left New York, he got in line at that time. So it wouldn't be too long nowadays, but you could get a 20-minute delay.
Mainly like through vectoring or a holding pattern, or what kind of?
Yeah, we'd probably just vector you around. Controllers don't do a whole lot of holding anymore. We just kind of prefer to vector.
Gotcha. Easier for probably less workload for both sides. So probably more common approach to Class B airspace versus landing at the primary airport, and it's a common question, is sightseeing. Usually there's a big city or some interesting ground sightseeing to do. How do you approach that from a pilot standpoint? Does that a burdensome on the controller to use the radar services but not actually land at the airport, but still be pretty close to the congested area? And what's the kind of radio call that a pilot should make if they want to request a sightseeing flight?
Yeah, just tell us where you want to sightsee. I mean, you're not the first one to do it. Everyone wants to sightsee over downtown, or they want to follow the river. I mean, those are the two popular ones around us. And every city, has the same thing where people basically want to do the same thing. So I would say we want to do sightseeing over downtown. I want to do sightseeing over Kings Island, um, or I'm just flying around. We put JFA on you, just flying around, and because we know you're going to keep turning. You're just all of a sudden going to turn on us. So that just helps us to keep aware of it. But Cincinnati doesn't seem to be a problem over downtown. We got that big tall antenna over downtown, which if you're sightseeing, you're usually below the minimum vectoring altitude, so you're not interfering with anything that we have at Cincinnati. And that was true. Most of the facilities I worked with where the downtown sightseers didn't interfere very much.
So that was a question I had actually that related to the minimum vectoring altitude. So VFR flights, that doesn't apply. You're on your own, right? At that point, as PIC, you make the decision on the altitude, and the controller doesn't have a certain point he needs to have you at when you're doing that route.
Right. The thing I cannot do is assign you an altitude and a heading. Now, most controllers won't assign an altitude below the MVA, even though we're allowed to do that. You get a lot of pushback. People are like, oh, no, I can't do that. But yes, I can actually assign an altitude below the MVA as long as I don't put you on a vector. So, if you want to say you want to fly around downtown at 2,000 feet, I can say, Roger, maintain 2,000. And you shouldn't change unless you tell me. But
One last
we did it
question
down
here.
in Daytona a lot.
One question we had, and this relates to Cincinnati, and I know a lot of other airspace too. If I am sightseeing or just transitioning the airspace, and I'm talking to the Class B radar controller, but my flight path or altitude is going to cross or come into a Class D airspace, how's the communication work there? Can I assume if I'm talking to the Class B controller that I'm okay to fly through the Class D, or do I need to, do something special as a pilot in that scenario?
Yeah, if you're receiving services from the radar, they are responsible to advise the Class D airport of your presence and get permission for you to be there.
Okay, good. So one less thing that you have to worry about are switching frequencies to call the Class D controller.
Right. So, but you need plan. Say you departed an airport and you were trying to get radar services, you need to think about that. If you were heading towards a Class D and the radar controller hadn't given you radar contact yet, now you're in a situation where you got to call that Class D, or you got to remain outside the Class D until the radar controller gives you radar contact.
Okay, and would that typically be after a transponder code change also, I assume?
Yeah, I mean, when you get airborne, we're gonna give you a code, but you just need to plan in advance that if I'm planning on, departing this non-controlled field, but heading over this Class D, but I want to get radar service, I need to establish that radar service before I get to the Class D airspace. So if for
Got it.
some reason that radar controller is busy, maybe I need to go call the Class D real quick or turn to avoid their airspace until I get radar contact with the radar controller.
Okay, makes sense. Let's talk about en route flying a little bit and kind of some IFR instrument topics. So let's start with route planning a little bit. When filing an IFR flight plan, and we're going to consider we're flying a Cessna 182, 172, 8 to 12,000 feet. But when filing an IFR flight plan, when is it okay to file GPS direct versus airways, routes, SID, stars, that kind of thing? What should be my decision making in that process?
I would pretty much always just file direct, file what you wanted. Unless I'm up in the upper northeast, where it's in real congested airspace, um, file direct. And if we don't like it, we will give you the route that we're going to give you anyhow. If there's a standard instrument departure for your airport, we're probably going to throw that on you, but you can say, I don't want it. You can say no SIDs, no stars in your flight plan. Now we can still give them to you, but we'll have to spell the route out for you. We'll have to give you the radials and the fixes. But it really depends on the airspace. So I'm not in real busy airspace. Even if I was leaving Claremont County, I'm heading towards Cincinnati, I'd still just file direct to my destination, and let us amend you as necessary. Now, altitude-wise, if you're by a major airport, you probably want to stay, below 10,000 feet, because when you file above 10, you get put in with the jets, the routes, the handing off to the center. So we want to get everybody going out the same point, and so you may get vectored way out of your way just to try and be on the same routing with jets. So, if you want 12, file for 8. After you get airborne, say, hey, would 12,000 be available? It's no problem for us to make an altitude change.
Okay. I know one thing I've done in the last probably 5-6 years, and it's really helped, even in less busy airspace, but in ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot or flightplan.com, whatever planning app, you can see recently cleared ATC routes based on your aircraft performance and altitude. And like you said, a lot of times in the Midwest here, it's direct. Uh, One question I had on that, and it's might be an old school approach to it, but there used to be advice that you should always file at least one intersection or one VOR in each center for longer trips. Is that still the case, or is that kind of going overboard and overthinking the situation?
Yeah, I think that problem's really been solved. What happens with our computers is the center has like the mainframe, and terminals are kind of an offshoot off of them. So, I mean, our computers are standalone, but just for our airspace. We can't do much beyond airspace. Whereas the center, because it's such a bigger area, they're able to see things. Like if you say you had filed a route to go around a restricted area, and you're talking to the center, and you said, "Hey, can I go direct?" Their computers are more apt to pick up on the fact that, hey, that restricted area is hot, and tell you, well, direct wouldn't be a good clearance. Whereas in the terminal, I only know what's going on right here in my airspace. I don't know about anything beyond my airspace. So if you say you want to go direct to Los Angeles, I'm going to say you clear direct to Los Angeles. I can't help what's going to happen further down the way.
Sure. And I think that was a question too. If you're flying a trip across multiple centers, one center might clear you direct destination, say down to Florida or South Carolina, if coming out of the Midwest. But then the next center, when you get handed off, they give you a new clearance. I assume that's why then, because they're analyzing their airspace more carefully and looking at more of the variables there that the other center didn't have the knowledge of, I assume.
Yeah, the center will see somewhat into the next center's airspace to know what's hot and cold. But what could be, well, the reason we give you direct is because we always want to help you. At least we think we're helping you, but because we're giving you direct. But another thing that plays into that is letters of agreement. How do you hand aircraft off from one person to another? So when Cincinnati hands aircraft off to Louisville, they have to be at certain altitudes on certain routes. And the busier the airspace gets, the more restrictive that gets. When Cincinnati was super busy, we were like the 5th busiest airport at one time. We were real restrictive on how we took aircraft from surrounding approach controls. Well, the only person who knew that was that approach control. So the center or the approach control on the other side of them had no idea of knowing that you had to be over a certain fix. So they'd say, you want to go direct? Sure, you're cleared direct. And then once you talk to Louisville, Louisville's like, no, you got to be over this fix at this altitude, and your route gets changed.
Gotcha. Now, en route, when you're working with the center, let's say, and even really terminal, I guess, for part of this question, are the controllers required to inform, and we'll assume VFR pilots in this case, of active MOAs, which we can obviously traverse as VFR pilots, But more importantly, are they required to tell you about the status of TFRs if you're approaching one?
TFRs, we're kind of somewhat responsible for enforcing. So yes, we should definitely tell you about the TFR, because if you go into it, we're supposed to violate you. So we better be telling you. We're even supposed to tell you when you're approaching a Class Bravo airspace. So if Louisville was handing you off to Cincinnati, um, technically, they should really tell you you're approaching Bravo airspace in 15 miles. Not too many people do that. The MOAs, I'd never worked in the center, but I would assume that they would. I know here at Cincinnati, we would tell you, because the center doesn't really like to work you through an MOA. They will. They definitely won't work an IFR through, of course, when it's hot. So we just tried to push aircraft away from the MOA.
Okay, makes sense. A couple more questions. I know you wanted to cover a couple slides here that we'll look at next. Kind of give a little bit of insight in terms of what the controller is actually seeing on the scope.
Well, that haze you see there is weather. So we depict 6 different levels of weather. We describe it in 4 different levels. And the reason we do that is so that when I tell you the weather is extreme, it's the same level as when the center says that it is extreme. Okay, yeah, here you go. So you can see the blue is just light, and then the moderate has dots, and then as those dots get closer together, that's another level, but it's still being called moderate. And then there's a color change to a brown, which really doesn't show up well here, and you get into your heavy and extreme precipitation. We're more accurate on showing where the precipitation is. We do not know the turbulence that's involved. In the winter months, there's a lot of times where there's extreme precipitation on final and everyone is getting a smooth ride. Obviously, though, in the summer, when it's thunderstorms, they're not getting a smooth ride. And the only way we know what the ride is like is if you tell us. That kind of brings up PIREPs. We don't know what the weather is like out there unless you tell us. I was flying in the jump seat on an airliner, and we hit some really bad bumps, and the captain apologized to the passengers, but he never told ATC. And so his buddy 10 miles behind us is going to hit that same bump, and he has no warning. So we love for you to give us PIREPs. It is not a hassle for you to give us PIREPs. We've got to have them. It's in a demand right now, because anytime there's an accident and there was any weather nearby, we're going to court. Someone's going to sue us and say, well, if you just told him about the weather, he never would have died. So we already know where you are, and we know your type aircraft, and we probably know the altitude you're at because you're probably level. So to just say, hey, I'm getting moderate turbulence here, that's all you have to say, and you've given us a PIREP, and then we can fill the form out from there. But tell us what your ride is like.
So a couple questions on the screen we're looking at here. This is the precipitation intensity as far as the controller sees it. What's the source of this weather information? And is that real time or is that delayed at all?
Terminals is real time. Center is delayed because they have to put it together with a bunch of different radar sites. But ours is real time.
All right, so let's look at that heavy spot there. So if you have a airplane, the course goes through that heavy spot. Are you required or any responsibility to keep them clear of that, or is it more of a workload and you being a good controller to keep them out of that? What's the level of responsibility there?
My responsibility is to tell you about it, and it stops there. Now, to keep a nice flow of traffic, we usually work you around it because we don't want people going off in different directions. So we usually try and steer you a certain way. But if you put that on final, I am going to vector you to the final. I am going to tell you about the heavy or extreme precipitation and clear you for the approach, because you want to land, and my job is to get you to the final so that you can land. You have to tell me, no, I'm not flying through that.
Okay, and then so a pilot tells you that in a case you have the background information here. What's the fine line of a pilot says I'm not doing this, but you also have traffic conflicts? Because I've heard of pilots saying in busy airspace or on arrivals that the arrival's taking them right through a thunderstorm, and they had to declare an emergency or vector themselves off outside of an ATC clearance because the controller wouldn't allow them. that seems like an extreme example, but it's a case where the pilot had to take, the control of the situation, because the controller may not have recognized how what they were seeing out the window in front of them.
Yeah, I'd say probably what has happened is that the weather has pushed the arrivals maybe into the departures airspace, and people haven't planned ahead of time. Because I mean, usually, weather doesn't move fast. It may build fast, but there's usually time to, start working your route around it. But sometimes you'll get squeezed up against somebody else, and if you haven't had time to coordinate, um, I can't approve the deviation if I can't get through the other controller because he's too busy. I'm kind of between a rock and a hard place, and the right thing for you to do is to just declare the emergency and just go ahead and say, I have to deviate. I mean, you are the one whose life is at stake. Do whatever's necessary. Even if it's not like a thunderstorm, it could just be a cloud. You're a VFR pilot. You cannot go into the cloud. You need to turn to miss it. And if it's a small deviation, I'm never going to notice it on the radar. But if you're going to have to deviate, 30 degrees to go around some weather, then you need to tell me that that's what you need to do, VFR or IFR.
Yeah, I
In
think.
the wintertime, there's icing. So if you can't fly into the clouds because of icing, you need to let me know. We're going to try and maintain VFR conditions here as long as possible due to icing.
We'll get into ADSB out a little bit more here in just a minute, but from an ADSB in perspective, pilots are flying with more weather information now, thanks to the affordable portable ADSB receivers that most of us have, and an iPad or data link weather on the screen. Have you noticed? Has that made your life as a controller easier, better, different because the pilot has more information and can make decisions maybe further in advance? Have you noticed any benefits of that from your perspective?
No, I can't say that I have. Um, I don't know. Been dealing with weather for a long time. I guess it's helpful for that pilot that's out there by himself. One advantage to being a busy airport is, you have that first aircraft that goes through the weather and tells you what it's like, and then everyone else just kind of follows him, and you adjust as the conditions change. So you're always getting, feedback. Um, so that helps that lone person who's, transitioning out there to the west when nobody else is, and all I can tell them is, hey, I'm seeing, heavy precipitation.
Sure, same thing. I want to make a quick point here. It's 8 o'clock. That was the scheduled end of the presentation. Eddie and I both have a little more time here, so we're going to keep going. Feel free to stick around if you have the time and schedule. If not, like I mentioned, the recording will be up tomorrow on the Sporties YouTube channel, so feel free to check back then. But Eddie, if you're okay, we'll keep on going here a little bit longer
Sure.
with more information. Another question we get is on the ADSB outside. We're year and a half now past the 2020 mandate. So basically everywhere that required mode C transponders now requires an ADSB out transponder. How has that technology affected the job of the controller, if any at all?
Yeah, when ADSB first started, they showed on the data blocks, whether you had it and whether or not it was up to a certain capability, and pretty much all the controllers turned it off because we really didn't care at that point. Where it helps us is in places where there's not good radar coverage. Um, Between two approach controls that are 60 miles apart, it's line of sight. So like between us and Huntington, there's a blind spot area there where nobody has any radar coverage until ADSB came along, and now all of a sudden we can see aircraft at just 1,000 feet above the ground out there. I've seen aircraft taxiing up at Middletown, an airport 30 miles north of us. So it's really helped in filling in the gaps around the United States that didn't have good radar coverage. Unfortunately, at the Cincinnati Lunken Airport, they didn't put it in the right spot, so we still can't see you to the ground there. But here down towards Knoxville, there was a real dead areas, and they're filling in all those with the ADSB. So that's really helping us. But for the controller, the one thing that we can do that helps is if you're flying out there VFR, we can now know your call sign. And there's downsides of that, but there's good sides. We had an IFR that we had kind of lost, but we found his 1200 code, and we thought, there he is, and we were able to track him down and close out his flight plan that he forgot to close. So it has been good in tracking aircraft. you can, unfortunately, it goes out on FlightAware. If you don't want it to be out on FlightAware, then you can, I know there's some paperwork you can fill out to not have your tail number given out.
Sure, and that was a question too pilots had. Is there more Big Brother effect in terms of do you see more information about an airplane? You know, if you're not talking to them, but do you know more about airplanes now for good or bad purposes at this point, or is it pretty much the same?
Well, I mean, the fact that I can get your tail number right away, you know, that's helpful. Um, we've had situations where aircraft have busted the Bravo airspace, and I'll tell you truthfully, if it's negligible, we're not looking to ever, you know, get people in trouble. But if you cross a mile off the departure of the runway because you were sightseeing and you forgot the Cincinnati airport was there, we need to talk. And that happened one day. So, yeah, um, yeah,
Yeah,
it's a good thing.
that kind of leads into another question, and we're going to talk a little bit more about IFR and route here. So this is a question related to radar services, ADSB out, everything that goes into tracking aircraft location. What are my tolerances? I'm flying on an IFR flight plan. Direct to fix or the destination at a altitude, let's say 7 or 8 thousand feet. What are my tolerances flying that flight? What can I don't say get away with, but if I have, some turbulence and I lose my altitude a little bit or I'm off heading, what are my tolerances before something gets your attention as the controller and you need to say something or even go as far as a pilot deviation?
Well, 300 feet, is tolerable. I mean, your mode C can be off 299 feet and considered good. So, to see a 300-foot deviation is no big deal. Now, if you're coming to a point where I'm going to start issuing traffic, there's somebody out there, I may question you. Hey, just verify you're really at 4,500 or level at 4, just to make sure. Um, the only time we really, I think, bust people on their altitude is when they're like 1,000 feet off and they're getting ready to conflict with other IFR traffic. Um, I think we're pretty lenient on that. And as far as routes, airways were 4 miles wide back in the day because that's the best people could do was stay within 4 miles of the radial. In fact, they found that still that wasn't getting everybody, so airways are protected beyond 4 miles. Uh, but now with RNAV, the problem is that everyone is nailed right down to the center line, and that actually has caused more conflicts because everyone is right on the center line. There isn't this I'm off a little bit. We have an arrival route which turns downwind for the runway, and then we take you off that arrival route and put you on the final. And one turns north and one turns south. Well, this particular day we were landing to the west, and the controller forgot to take them off the arrival route, and these two aircraft both turned downwind into each other because one came from the north, one came from the south. And that's probably the scariest thing that I have seen in a radar replay, and it was caused because of they were on RNAV routes and they were just nose to nose.
Oh well.
So it's got its good points and bad points. On radar, you can't even see a mile. If you're a mile off, unless you're on the final and I've got that final depicted, I cannot tell that you are a mile off course.
What what if I'm transitioning down to a lower altitude and it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the summer and there's some buildups up ahead and I just need to go 5 or 10 degrees left or right? Can I or should I get away with just doing that on my own, or should I be telling or requesting a clearance from the controller for a minor deviation like that?
If you were just going to turn 15 degrees right for just a minute, and then you're going to come back, I would say we would probably never notice. It's good just to say, can I have 15 right for weather? Just so I know you're doing it. But usually, I mean, unless you're on a line that I can come back to and see that you're off course, I'm not going to notice it. Although some controllers put a stinger on an aircraft which shows your exact heading, what you're doing. And we had an accident where this aircraft flew like 40, 50 miles on airspace, and twice the controller noticed that he was flying a heading that was like 40 degrees off what he was supposed to be on. And he corrected the pilot. He says, "Verify you're going direct here." But if it's just a minor deviation, targets actually jump a little bit. So it wouldn't be noticed. Anything less than 20 degrees for a short period of time would not be noticed.
Okay. Let's talk a little more on the IFR on the terminal side. So first question related to an IFR clearance at a non-towered airport. Uh, would you prefer a pilot to request their IFR clearance via the RCO, a remote communication frequency on the ground, or if it's VFR, would you prefer them to depart VFR and then pick up the clearance when airborne?
Well, my personal preference is, pick it up in the air because that doesn't clog up things. However, there could be situations where if you were a faster moving aircraft, it can cause some problems. It just coordination problems that have, to do with another controller. I would say now the best thing that I would do is, because we've started publishing phone numbers, a lot of people are just calling in and getting their IFR clearance. So now you know exactly what kind of clearance you're going to get. Taxi out, and if for some reason we can't give you a release, say, can I depart VFR and pick it up, when I'm airborne? You already know what the clearance is going to be. You already got the transponder code. The controller can say, sure, VFR departure approved. And now you get airborne and you call me, and once I have you radar identified and you're 3 miles away from any other traffic, I can say, okay, now you're IFR.
Huh,
So
okay.
that would be what I would do. That would just be the easiest. That way I know my flight plan's in the system, because you don't want to get airborne and then find out, oh, your flight plan was filed for the wrong time.
Right, once you're airborne, and then yeah. And no, so that brings up another question. Let's say you don't have the flight plan details set properly, whether it's time or something else, and the controller doesn't have it. What about a pop-up IFR clearance? How do you feel about that?
I have no problem with that, and I think the control, for a while there, had a lot of lawsuits, and so there was this hesitancy for controllers to give you a pop-up IFR clearance. I mean, I'm not going to ask you, are you qualified and rated and all that. I may ask you, do you have the NOTAMs? Because that's the thing we got in trouble for. Somebody landed at an airport and hit a ditch. I don't know how it happened, but it became our fault because we gave them the IFR clearance. But really, I mean, to put in a flight plan, unless I'm just short-staffed, is really not a problem. Distinguish whether or not you just want a local IFR clearance, or if you actually want a clearance all the way to your destination. A lot of times people just want to get on top of the clouds or above the fog, and they just want a local IFR to climb above the clouds. Not to be confused with a VFR on top. VFR on top is an actual IFR clearance on an IFR flight plan, to which you get above the clouds, and now you proceed VFR, but you're still on your IFR flight plan. I've had controllers and pilots alike get that confused a lot.
Gotcha. So that's where the terminology is very important to make sure you and the controller are on the same page.
Yes.
One more topic had a lot of interest in, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. Talking about flight following, particularly VFR flight following. So we mentioned earlier, and you said this specifically, that you would prefer, especially in busier airspace, to be talking to a pilot versus them transitioning above or below Class B airspace. Uh, and that goes for en route also. So first question, if I'm requesting VFR flight following, and I've had this experience personally, sometimes I'm handed off to the next controller, whether it's in Cincinnati area going to Columbus Approach or Indianapolis Center. There's also times where I've been established with flight following with Greater Cincinnati radar control, but then it's terminated 30 or 40 miles out. How do I ensure, what's the best way to go about to ensure that I'm in the system, as you put it, and can get handoffs to the next controller?
Yeah, as long as your beacon code doesn't start with a 0, you should be in the system the whole way. We did have a problem with one of our surrounding approach controls. They had 2 controllers there that did not want to work VFR flight following. They'd rather re-identify you themselves, and they used to make us terminate people. I mean, to me, it was, you're making more work for yourself. But yeah, you shouldn't have been terminated if you had something other than a 0, a code that started with something other than 0.
So if I hear that now and I get squawk 0142, could I ask you? And I'm sure most pilots outside of this conversation here aren't going to be aware of that, but would you say, hey, I want flight following all the way to my destination, or how would you talk back
Yeah,
to the
I would say
controller to?
I'd say it just like that. And sometimes it happens that we give you that code first, and then I realize, oh, you wanted flight following to your destination, and now I've got to get you in the system and type in a new code. It's so easy these days to put aircraft in for VFR flight following. Now it defaults by putting you in direct, and it defaults, your speed wise to like 120, but it's good enough.
Okay. If I'm outside of Cincinnati, how can I figure out a frequency? Let's say I'm unfamiliar with the area. What's the best way to determine who to call for flight following in various scenarios?
Um, Look on the airport facility directory for the approach control frequency for that airport, or on L charts they got frequencies. And I think on the flap on the sectionals usually there's frequencies too.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the questions was, let's say you just have, Cincinnati has multiple frequencies. We'll use that as a scenario. But if I have one and I'm not sure if it's the exact right spot or the right sector, is that okay if I just call that frequency? And would that person get me to the right person, or how would that work?
Yes, they should. And at Cincinnati, we're usually working multiple frequencies because although we're set up to have 10 different radar scopes, we only run 3. So everyone uses the monitors more than one frequency.
Okay, so they could hand or tell you another frequency if you do call up on the wrong one. That's not going to be a big deal at that point.
Right. Yeah.
Now, when you're en route, then you tell them you're going to be at 4,500 or 5,500. If you want to change altitude, are you required to let the controller know, or can you do that on your own?
If he has not assigned it, you're not required. It's a good idea. Um, it's a very good idea. I wouldn't change altitudes without telling us.
Okay, I think there's a lot of concern about violations or getting in trouble if you deviate around either on a heading or an altitude change, without letting the controller know. Kind of differentiating it from an IFR clearance or an IFR flight where you're on a set path and set altitude.
Yeah, you're probably not going to get deviated. I mean, we're not going to call flight standards and drag them into it, because you are a VFR. Um, it would just be much appreciated. Now, someone did
Gotcha.
ask a question about getting into Bravo airspace if the controller doesn't say exactly cleared into Bravo airspace. That's your opportunity on the readback, to say, understand cleared into Bravo airspace. Because what you read back is what your clearance is.
Gotcha. And it's the controller's job at that point to clarify and revoke the clearance if they don't want you in there or confirm it.
Correct.
Okay. Couple little last questions here, just related to phraseology that common misconceptions, myth versus fact. How important are the phonetics? So in the AIM, it has Quebec, tree, fife, niner. Uh, does the controller, do you want to hear that? Does it matter that much if you get the message? What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's not as important as it used to be. I mean, back in the day when no one wore headsets and we had these scratchy old radios, that was very important. Today with headsets and the radios being much better, it's not nearly as important.
Okay, so don't go out of your way to use all the phonetics if you don't feel you need to, or the message is getting across to the controller. There's not a violation, or you're not gonna get in trouble, or the controller's gonna
Right.
snap back at you.
We have one controller that likes to say tree for 3, but nobody else does, and they just do it for the fun of it.
Gotcha. That's a good point, though. Yeah, how the headset technology and the radio technology has really improved. What about the call sign for your airplane? So sometimes you'll hear Cessna, uh, sometimes you'll hear Skyhawk or Skylane. Does that matter, or is that important to the controller to know what model aircraft?
Well, it's like this. If you call me and you say you're a Cessna, the picture I'm going to have is Cessna 172. You call and you say Twin Cessna, I'm going to think Sky King. Okay, most of you don't know what Sky King is, but that's it was an old show with a Twin Cessna in it. But if you say Citation, see, now I'm going to think totally different. So it depends on what you want me to think about you. So if you say Baron, I'm thinking, oh, fast twin engine aircraft. So by giving me the type, being more specific, it gives me a better idea of who you are. Between a 172, 182, you're both doing. The 182 is a little faster, but it's not that much faster. Centurion, okay, that's a lot faster. So it's somewhat important. It's an easy way of letting me know what type airplane you're flying. Instead of saying November, say your type aircraft. And call sign wise, a lot of times we only use the 3 numbers. on your initial call up, we actually do need the 5, because if I put you into the system, when I tag your aircraft with that 3-letter call sign, it's going to say that it's the wrong call sign because ADSB is telling me your full call sign. So when you first call us, give us the full call sign so we can put it in. But after that, the last 3 is good enough, unless somebody else has a similar call sign.
Got it. Okay, one last question, controversial, and I'm going to read this verbatim as the person wrote it. Is the term "with you" as awful as the internet thinks?
Well, it depends on where you work. So at Cincinnati, with you is not that bad because 90% of our traffic is an airliner who's on an IFR clearance, and they've actually been handed off to me. So when he calls me, I should know who he is. When you as a GA aircraft not receiving flight following calls on the frequency and says, with me, I'm thinking I should know who you are. So I'm trying to find your tag. And if I can't find it, now I'm starting to look at other people's tags, which are not necessarily displayed on my scope, trying to find out what frequency you're supposed to be on. So it's just a wasted word that doesn't need to be there. So I would lose it. If I want to be cool, go with the 2704 code, the beacon code thing, just rattle off the numbers.
Right, right.
But the with you is, yeah.
All right, we'll put an official end to that tonight. That is not the way to go. Eddie, thank you again so much. This is fantastic. Again, I learn something new every time that we talk and work together, and I'm sure the group here did tonight as well. One final point again, this is recorded and we'll have it up on the Sporty's YouTube channel tomorrow, so come back and check it out and pass this along to your other fellow pilots to spread the information. There's really not a better source out there as far as I'm concerned than Eddie and his great experience working just the vast variety of air traffic control facilities and a pilot flying actively today. So Eddie, thanks again for your time tonight and sharing this information with everyone.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, have a good evening, and we'll see you in the next Sporty's webinar next month. Good night.